And we should be all set. So you can go ahead. Do you want me to just let me know when to advance the slides, and I'll put my microphone on mute to reduce the background noise.
Perfect, excellent. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Niels van Tienen. I'm here to talk about clinical data for the 510K process in the United States for the FDA. And this is a webinar for the upcoming workshop in Amsterdam on October 11 and 12. Let me introduce myself on the next slide. There you go. The picture of the dogs is normally not in there, but one of the questions of the registers was, what was my favorite dog? So I thought I should answer this question by putting this picture in there. This was me as a little kid. At the bottom, this is what I look like right now. I am the Director of Education at Factory CRO for Medical Devices. We're located in Bilthoven, the Netherlands, Princeton, New Jersey, United States, and San Diego, United States. I've been a physical educator in my previous life, and I worked for Medtronic in Minneapolis and in Holland, and I spent almost 10 years at Factory CRO as a CRA and a project manager, and currently I am moving towards the education training role, but I am still leading the clinical operations team. Please go ahead, Rob. The audience, I believe all of us are in the medical devices and most of us are in the regulatory affairs, and we're all medical devices specialists. And go ahead, Rob. And this is what I would like to address today. Briefly, the US regulatory overview, and briefly the 510K program. What kind of data do we need, and what are the options? Okay. One more, Rob, this is just a blank. Yes, there we go. Very briefly, FDA. Their mission is to assure safety and effectiveness for many products, including medical devices. And they want to advance public health by helping to speed innovations. The Center for Devices and Radiological Health is basically reviewing device registration applications and reviewing safety of medical devices. Please go ahead. To begin with, there is a chart. I would briefly like to touch on the acts that have been implemented. As you can see, the first drug standards have been implemented in the 1820s. In 1967, the Medical Devices Amendment Act was implemented, and it was the act to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act. And that was basically the first time that the FDA was given the authority to begin regulating medical devices. The interpretation of these acts is published in the Federal Register, and the final rule is published in the CFR. Important to understand is that devices before May 28, 67 could stay on the market until further notice, and that the concept of substantial equivalence was established. And this is very important to understand since we will be talking about 510K. Okay, please go ahead. The FDA Modernization Act from '97 is important to touch on because this was the first time that the de novo process was implemented. This means that the FDMA enabled new lower risk devices a de novo reclassification to class 1 or 2 after they have been ruled non-substantially equivalent, which means if companies applied for a 510K process and it was denied, meaning devices were not substantially equivalent, they could reclassify to class 1 or 2. Before this act, devices were automatically classified to class 3, which means they were forced into the PMA route, which is actually the route for class 3 devices. Also for the Modernization Act, it is important to understand that they focused on a risk-based approach, and they implemented exempt devices which do not require FDA review to provide a reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. Some class 1 devices require a 510K, and some class 2 devices are 510K exempt, but they do require a special control. Then in 2012, the Safety Innovation Act, there was an immediate de novo implemented, which means if your device is a class 1 or 2, there is no need to do the whole 510K application to be ruled non-substantially equivalent. If you already know you don't have a predicate device, you can reclassify your device with the FDA immediately without doing the 510K. Okay. This is basically an overview to look back if you want to basically study or see everything in one overview. There is 3 classes of devices. Most of the devices, 45 and 50%, are in the class 1 and class 2. What you see on the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6th column is that most of the class 2 devices are in the 510K route. Some of them are exempt, some require PMA, and only 10 to 20% require clinical data in the process. Class 1 devices, many of them are 510K exempt, and class 3, most of them are in the PMA process. And basically all of them require clinical data from clinical studies in the process. The risk level is from low to high, and I will tell you a little more about risk levels in the United States in a few minutes. Okay? Determination of classification. In the EU and Canada, we have a rule-based classification system. There is a MEDEF guidance document. The name is here, 2.4/1, Classification of Medical Devices, under the Medical Device Directive or the Active Implantable Medical Device Directive. And the classification rules are based on the invasiveness. Are devices in the body longer than 60 minutes, longer than 30 days, or permanent? And it's also important to understand what part of the body was affected. Cardiac devices are almost always class 3. Non-invasive devices are mostly class 1. However, we do see reclassification rules by the implementation of new directives. Breast implants, class 3, after the PIP scandal in Europe. Hip, knee, shoulder, joint replacements, also all class 3. And you see in the medical device regulation, which was implemented in May 26 last year, with a transition period of 3 years, that all joint replacements are class 3 as of 2020. In the United States, classification is based upon the identification of a 3-letter product code or a product description. The product description defines and describes the device, and it corresponds to the device classification and also the submission requirements. Many products fall under a single number, and the link to the classification database is here, and it's actually very helpful to take a look at the database and see what it all looks like. Please advance to the next slide. For example, I put in a vascular closure device. I looked for vascular and hemostasis, and this is what the database comes up with. It's class 3. The submission type is a PMA, consistent with what we've seen in the matrix, PMA for class 3 products. And you see there is no third-party review acceptable. And if you go to the next slide, I have an example for 510K. I put in Infusion Pump. You see device class 2. You see submission type in the middle, 510K. And you see the recognized consensus standards, guidance documents, and so on. So a lot of information is here. Very important to understand that you can also find the product code, MRZ. And this is important to remember. Okay, please advance. What does the whole FDA medical device approval process look like? So we talked about classification, searching the FDA classification database, finding your 3-letter code. Class 1 devices do need to comply with QSR, the quality system regulations, and for class 1 devices, this comes down to good manufacturing practices, except for part 820 of the CFR. However, class 2 and 3 devices, you need to implement a quality management system that meets the FDA quality system regulation found in this CFR. Basically, this comes down to the same level or the same standard as the ISO 13485 in Europe, content-wise. However, in Europe, this is a certification system. The FDA does not audit and certify companies for being CFR compliant. This is basically a law and you need to adhere to it. Innovative class 2 and all class 3 devices will likely require clinical studies. If you need to do or perform clinical studies, you need to apply for an IDE. I will explain more about this later in the presentation. You need to develop a protocol and conduct a study. Non-significant risk studies may be performed with IRB approval only. For class 2 devices, you need to submit a pre-market notification application. For class 3 devices, you need a PMA, a pre-market approval application. For class 3 devices, the FDA conducts facility inspections. For class 1 and 2 devices, there is no facility inspection before devices are cleared, but random inspections may be performed by the FDA. When you have successfully completed the 510K route, there is a clearance letter and will be posted online. For class 3 devices, the FDA issues a PMA approval letter and posts it online. Well, I touched on item 8 already. You need a FDA US agent if you have no local presence in the United States, and you need to list your device and register your company on the FDA website. And then you can sell your device. Okay. The actual 510K program looks like this. Formally, it is evaluating substantial equivalence in pre-market notifications. The link is a guidance document. The principles in this guidance are applicable to devices that are reviewed by the Center of Devices and Radiological Health, but also IVDs, reviewed by In Vitro Diagnostics and Radiological Health, and biologics, reviewed by the Center of Biologics Evaluation and Research. In total, 65% of the devices are exempt from the 510K notification. And there is a few different programs under the 510K umbrella. You have the traditional program, and there is an average time of 177 days to clearance. There is a special program for devices with design changes to already cleared devices with a 76 days to clearance. And there is an abbreviated program, which is very rare. So I don't want to spend any time on this. Let's move to the next slide. What does it actually mean, substantially equivalent? It means that the device has the same intended use as a predicate device, and it has the same technological characteristics, or it is the same intended use and it has different technological characteristics, but then the submitted information, including appropriate clinical or scientific data, demonstrates that the device is as safe and effective as the already legally marketed device. And it does not raise questions regarding safety and effectiveness compared to the predicate device. What does the FDA consider different technological characteristics are significant changes in the materials, significant changes in the design, in the energy source, or any other features of the device. Okay. This is the definition of a predicate device. Most importantly to understand is that is as a new post Medical Devices Amendments Act device must undergo approval by the FDA via a PMA route, like a Class 3 device, unless it is the same type of device that was already on the US market before the act was implemented or enacted. But then it has to show to be substantially equivalent to such a device. Or it is the same type of device the FDA classified as a Class 1 or 2, for which pre-market notification is required, but then a new device must be shown to be substantially equivalent to such a device. So basically, legally marketed before 76, or been reclassified from Class 3 to Class 2 or 1, or has to be found substantially equivalent through a 510K process. So basically, you are looking for a device already on the market that has the same intended use, meaning the same FDA product code. The indications for use might be slightly different, but should be as close as possible. The device should have similar technological characteristics. And you should identify a primary predicate. Secondary predicates are acceptable in some cases. Think of a spinal system consisting of more than one component. Then you can look for a secondary predicate. You should look for recently cleared devices that are still on the market. And obviously, you should look for recalls concerning your predicate device, because that would not be a good example. Okay, please advance. So how to determine the classification? Well, basically, as shown before, use relevant search terms. Search the FDA classification database. Try to identify another device with the same intended use and technologically as close as possible. Find the 3-letter product code and the 7-digit regulation number, or ask the FDA if you cannot find any products and you would like any assistance. When a product code is identified, search the database for products that have been cleared under that code. Then you should download the summaries for each potential predicate device, including the exact indications for use, the summary of the technological features, and sometimes there is also a list of testing that was conducted. Select a predicate device for which the indications for use most closely match those for your device. Indications for use describe the disease or condition the device will diagnose, treat, etc. Okay, please advance. Key points: select predicate devices with identical indications for use. Select predicate devices that employ similar technological features. And newer clearances are usually better than older ones. If you search the database, you can see what kind of submission comes with a product code that you have been looking for. Hopefully you will find 510K here, because if you have a class 3 product, then 510K is not applicable. Okay, please advance. As we have seen in the first part of the presentation, applicable recognized standards or guidance documents are identified in the database. Please understand those guidance documents are not a regulation. They're not legally binding, but they convey current expectations on a particular topic. And they are very beneficial for guiding development, testing, labeling, and so on. It's always important to understand when we talk about regulations, you should justify why your approach meets the regulatory requirements if you do not follow a guidance document. So it's more straightforward to follow guidance documents if those are identified. There is, under bullet 7, there is a link to all the guidance documents on the FDA website. I see some double entries here, so I would like to advance to the next slide, please. This is what a 510K format looks like. Those items should all be included. Please take a fast look, because during the workshop in Amsterdam, Rob Packard will discuss everything that comes with the actual 510K dossier. And if we move to the next slide, I put a picture in there. for October 11 and 12. And if you attend the workshop there, you will also receive a book from Rob Packard's Medical Device Academy, and this book will provide you all the information for the 510K dossier. Okay, please advance. It is important to understand when you have successfully cleared your device through the 510K process, that a 510K summary will be published on the FDA website. So there is some information regarding the device, the intended use, predicate device information, tests that have been performed, standards that have been used, available publicly on the FDA website. Okay, please advance. What are the most important Yes, thank you. What are the most important reasons for not being substantially equivalent? So basically, after the process is finalized, the FDA will rule SE, substantially equivalent, or NSE, non-substantially equivalent. This happens when the performance testing is inadequate, when you have not followed guidance documents, when there is an inadequate device description, problems with the indications for use or the instructions for use are inadequate, or when biocompatibility information is missing. But 80% of the NSE decisions are because of the predicate device comparison is inadequate or lacking information. Please move on. Please understand that the process is considerably more rigorous. They have implemented a few new processes like the e-copy test, the additional information required process, and the refuse to accept process. Top level, I would like to say about this that you need to submit both on paper and electronic copies. There is a one response requirement for sponsors to address concerns or requests for additional information. Please note that the 90-day clock stops when there is a request from the FDA. In some cases, clinical studies are requested where they have not done so previously. The refuse to accept process, they first review if your application is complete and consistent, if all the items are there regarding electrical safety and biocompatibility. They will inform you by sending a letter, the file is accepted and is ready for review. Please move on. When your file is ready and complete, they will subdivide your submission to various expert reviewers. So biocompatibility, risk management, electrical safety is all reviewed by specialists. And the actual data is being reviewed, and statements like work was done or high-level summaries are no longer sufficient. They are looking for underlying reports and evidence. Most important reason for the higher demand for 510K submissions is the several international standards recognized by the FDA have become de facto requirements for the submissions. So the risk management ISO standard 14971 and the 60610 electrical safety documents are de facto requirements. Like a number of sterility standards. Required testing for these standards can be extensive, time-consuming, and expensive. Okay? What is required in terms of data or testing? A manufacturer is responsible for ensuring a device is safe and effective. So you should perform design testing, mechanical testing, packaging, performance testing, biocompatibility testing to determine the potential toxicity. And the FDA recognizes the series of ISO standards, 10993, as guidance documents that provide you guidance for selecting the required testing. When software is involved, you should perform the validation testing for software. And the FDA considers virtually all software to be of moderate concern. However, yesterday I reviewed a post on LinkedIn, and the FDA has implemented a new pilot program for the upcoming 4 months to enable a more streamlined process for health apps and software technology. So that's fair. That might be a very good read. In addition, perform process testing like sterilization, validation, and transportation testing, and clinical risk assessments, use-related testing. So there we have usability testing and clinical studies. Okay, let's move on. Usability studies. They basically demonstrate that the user can read and understand the directions, instructions for use, and use the device correctly. Those studies require protocols and well-written reports, but they are not considered clinical research. There is a guidance document, which is very helpful. And basically, user testing boiled down to the following 4 questions. Can the prospective buyer properly determine whether the product is appropriate for them or not? For example, in terms of over-the-counter products. Can the user read instructions for use and properly use or deploy the device? Do users experience difficulties when using the device, but then most of the times it's simulating use? And does the usability study illuminate any potential risks that have not been considered in the earlier risk analysis? Okay, please advance. Clinical studies. When are clinical data required? In the past, there was no prospective data, clinical data required in 510(k) applications. But clinical data is required when we do see new or modified indications for use, when we see technological differences, and when we see non-clinical testing that was inappropriate because of the indications for use or device technology. In general, if you take a look at the FDA guidance documents, they are not necessarily looking for large clinical trials. They actually are moving to, or not moving towards, but they are expecting a small studies with relatively small number of patients and studies with a simple study design. If you compare to the pre-market approval process, because this basically comes down to comparing your device to a device that is already approved and released to the market. When clinical data is provided in support of a 510(k), then you are basically involving human subjects to determine the safety and effectiveness of your device. When this is the case, they are looking for valid scientific evidence, and studies must comply with IDE, the investigational device exemptions. Well, what does valid scientific evidence means? At the bottom of this slide, you see in bold, well-controlled investigations, partly controlled studies, studies and objective trials without matched controls, well-documented case histories, conducted by qualified experts, and all with the goal to find reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness of the device. What the FDA considers not valid is isolated case reports, random experience, reports lacking sufficient details. Okay, please move on. In the next 3 slides, I have a lot of text. I will only read out loud the bold sections to speed up a little bit, but I left all the language in there because it might be helpful to understand what the FDA's view is on when data is required. And the first slide is about new or modified indications for use. And obviously, devices, your predicate device, your comparator, needs the same intended use. So when a new device is an IVD, that is indicated for over-the-counter use, whereas the predicate device is indicated for prescription use in home or prescription use in a clinical setting. Same intended use, different indications for use. Or when your IVD is to be used for patients who have symptoms and signs of illness from closely related diseases. So the indications for the predicate IVD do not include one of the diseases for the new IVD. Or the third one, when the manufacturer modifies the indications for use by proposing a different surgical implementation method which affects the indications for use. For example, minimally invasive rather than an open procedure. Please advance. Second example, when we speak of technological differences. For example, bullet number 2, the predicate device is rigid, whereas the new device is designed to be more flexible. 3, when there is a change in software. Or when the technological characteristics of the new device raise a question whether its clinical performance can be expected to be equivalent to the clinical performance of the predicate. Okay, please advance. And the third set of examples is when the non-clinical testing methods are inappropriate. So the FDA requests clinical data to address issues that cannot be adequately addressed using non-clinical test methods. For example, the testing cannot replicate the way the device will be used, or if the non-clinical testing of a device raises safety concerns that cannot be mitigated or answered through non-clinical testing. All right, please advance. Clinical studies. What if you decide to actually perform clinical studies supporting your 510(k) submission? On the right-hand side, you see a picture of a printout or a print screen of the link that I put at the top, the ecfr.gov. It's a print screen of basically the Code of Federal Regulations from the FDA. I'm not going to read out, obviously, but I just want to show you, if you click this link, you can actually read all the requirements. However, I do have to admit, this is quite a tough read, since the information there is pretty comprehensive. If you need to perform a clinical trial for any device that is not cleared or approved by the FDA, which is then you basically need to adhere to the requirements of the IDE. And the first bullet says, if this regulation is there to allow the investigational product to be shipped and used in a clinical study. So, meaning in a controlled environment. This is compared to the ISO 14155 standard in Europe. And then ABC, A. This IDE applies to all clinical investigation of devices to determine safety and effectiveness, basically 510K or PMA route, except the exempt devices, which are class 1 devices. Or B, there is abbreviated requirements for non-significant risk devices. That's a different definition, and I will touch on this definition in a few slides. The requirements are as follows for an IDE study. You should have an investigational plan approved by the IRB. If it is a significant risk device, your IDE should be approved by the FDA also. You should have voluntarily informed consent from all patients. Labeling stating the device is for investigational use only. Proper monitoring. And sufficient recording and reports. I will discuss more in a minute, but I see we have already spent 45 minutes, so I might touch on those slides only briefly. Please advance. Yes, I want to discuss those slides very fast. What are the requirements of sponsors of clinical trials? You should select qualified investigators, and depending on the complexity of a study or the actual procedure of a medical device, it is important to understand that the investigators should have expert knowledge on the appropriate surgical techniques. So you can think of hands-on training with other physicians or engineers, or even proctoring cases in your clinical trial. Okay, let's advance. You should always provide the investigators with the necessary information, like copies of the protocol, but also documentation of the training and the proctoring. Just providing them with a protocol is not sufficient. You should monitor your clinical investigation, which means the actual data collected should be checked with the patient medical records. This is what we call data verification or source data verification. But you should also check if all the procedures are followed and if there is regulatory compliance. Well, let's go into more detail in Amsterdam what this all entails. Please advance. Always you need IRB approval for clinical trials. Under an IDE, but also if you perform post-market studies for marketed devices, you should go to an IRB and request for approval. and you see the 21 CFR 65. This is not the 812. Is always applicable to any clinical trial. The investigator, according to CFR 812-140, is responsible for keeping records, but I do suggest to help the sites by setting up a regulatory binding to file the documents as under 1.2.10, all the communication, all adverse events, IRB communication, progress reports, and agreements. Please advance. There is a few forms that are applicable if you file a 510K application that come with clinical studies. The financial arrangement of financial interests of your clinical investigators, and a certification of compliance with a registration on clinicaltrials.gov before you actually start executing your clinical investigation. Please advance. If you click on this link, I would like to point out that in this guidance document you have a few very interesting appendices. Appendix C is actually a sample of a whole process, including a 510K file, which is a very good read. Please advance. Please understand that clinical trials under the IDE requirements are time-consuming, very expensive, and require expensive and a burdensome control mechanism. So I do understand that manufacturers of medical devices want to stay away from such an effort. So is there anything else that can be done? I would like to point out that there is non-significant risk studies which do not need involvement of the FDA. I am not necessarily telling that the FDA is very expensive, but the time that comes with reviewing and approval clinical trials is very long. So if you can do a study for a device that does not present a potential risk, according to the definition, you can start your clinical trial without the involvement of the FDA. But obviously you need to go to an IRB and you need to apply for a non-significant risk study. There is also a guidance document for this. Please advance. This is the flow chart. So one back, please. Yes. So exempted class 1 devices do not require FDA, and non-significant risk studies also only need IRB approval before you can commence the clinical trial. Non-significant risk studies should still adhere to the requirements in terms of labeling, IRB approval, consent forms, monitoring, records and reports, and the prohibition against promotion. The advantage is you do not need to make progress reports or final reports to the FDA. And you do not need an approved IDA application by the FDA. Do not confuse this with a minimal risk determination for exempt devices, basically class 1 devices. Okay, move on to one of the last slides. Another option would be OUS studies. Studies conducted outside the United States do not need to comply with IDE regulations. Those studies need to be in compliance with Declaration of Helsinki or local laws, whichever is the most stringent. And the FDA recommends that such studies are to be conducted in accordance with good clinical practice. Good clinical practice, ICH GCP E6, which is basically a pharmaceutical guideline for conducting clinical trials or clinical studies. And then you need to adhere to the applicable sections, or you can look up the ISO 14155 standard from 2011, which is actually a recognized standard by the FDA. And in this standard, you can see how to design, plan, conduct, report data from medical devices clinical trials. So all the sections are applicable. And I find this a very straightforward document specific to medical devices trials. The standard will help ensure that international medical devices trials are conducted in accordance with good clinical practices, and that the reported results are credible and accurate, and obviously rights, safety, well-being of trial subjects is regulated. The FDA has issued a draft guidance document of acceptance of medical devices studies conducted outside of the United States, and the link is found here. Please advance. This is the last slide. I'm just showing you this. This is the International Medical Device Regulators Forum. And this is basically a working group that is reviewing international standards, and they have basically issued this document to show in what geographies ISO 14155 standards are accepted. And this is one of the standards that is accepted in most of the geographies, which enables manufacturers, CROs, and other parties involved in clinical trials to use one standard and use this basically as the common language. And the good thing is that in this ISO standard, you also have many appendices, and you can use those appendices as example documents for your protocol, for your investigator brochure, and so on and so on. Okay, thank you very much for your time, and I do believe we still have some time for questions.
Some time for questions. Thank you very much, Niels. I haven't received any emails from people yet regarding questions, but we had questions submitted prior to the event as well. There were a few things that I wanted to point out. People had asked certain questions, and some of them you've answered really well during the presentation. The first question that I wanted to get to, though, was there was a question about what are the quality management system requirements for clinical trials? And you covered that briefly in slide 13 at about 15 minutes into the presentation. In general, what I tell clients is that although you're not required to have a complete quality system in place prior to conducting a clinical study, you're certainly going to want to have control of documents. You're going to want to have design controls in place before you launch a product, because you want to release it internally and say it's okay to release that product for the clinical study. You're also going to want to make sure you have a CAPA process in place and a complaint handling process in place, so you can, if there are any problems that occur during the study, you can investigate those complaints and implement corrective actions. You're going to want a reporting procedure, because any adverse events need to be reported. So those are some of the key things that I want clients to focus on when they're doing a clinical study and they're preparing for it. They have to have some pieces of their quality system in place. But if you could elaborate on that, what other things you look for in the company before they conduct a clinical study for the quality system, that would be great.
Basically, you're looking for a system that defines procedures you adhere to. So when performing clinical trials, like I said before, when performing a clinical trial, it is important to look for and demonstrate that procedures are followed according to the protocol, according to the GCP standards, and for example, that your safety reporting is in place. And you need to do this according to procedures that are defined. And what you typically see is that you need a set of SOPs, standard operating procedures, defining when do I report, how do I report, what is the timing, and to look if you can meet those requirements. It's not necessarily a big problem if there is an isolated case of reporting too late, but then again, you need to know how, what the timing should have been, why you were too late, and you need to document this. And I do believe that this needs to fall under an umbrella. So if you just have a few loose end SOPs defining what to do, how to do it, or when to do it, I don't think this is going to work. It needs to fall under a system identifying what standard operating procedures I adhere to in the different processes.
Thank you, Niels. We had one person submit a question by chat. They were in one of the slides, slide 15, you had mentioned that 65% of the devices are exempt from 510Ks. So I think I can handle this question, but you're welcome to correct me if I misspeak at all. I believe in one of his slides, he indicated that there were somewhere in the order of 50 or 55% of the devices are class 1 devices.
Yeah, correct.
Some of those devices require a 510K, a few of the class 1 devices, but not very many of them. And then there are some class 2 devices, which represent the other, I think 40 or 45% of the device classifications. Some of those are exempt. So if you pool the devices that are class 1 that require a 510K, I'm sorry, the devices that are class 1 that do not require a 510K, and the devices that are class 2 that are exempt, together they equal 65%. And the way you know which ones are and which ones are not is you go into the product classification code database, and that's a 3-letter product code that you're looking up, and it will say 510K exempt for any of the products that are going to be exempt from 510Ks. If it says PMA, it would be a PMA submission. If it says 510K, it would be a 510K submission. But as Neil said, it's 65% of those are 510K exempt. And the FDA just recently released a fairly long list of product codes that they've newly made exempt because they're trying to streamline the process and downregulate devices that have shown a really great long-term history of safety. Did you have anything you want to add to that, Niels?
No, that's completely accurate.
Okay. Going on to questions here, there was one of the questions at the beginning was, 10 to 15% of all 510K submissions do not require a clinical study. What determines if you need a clinical study? And I think you did a great job of answering that in slide 30, at around 34 minutes in the presentation. If anybody has questions further, one of the things I would point them to is some of the product classification codes actually have special controls guidance documents that will specify when you would need a clinical study and when you would not need a clinical study. So that's an important thing to look for, is read your special controls guidance documents first. The FDA wants you to do homework before you go asking them questions. If there is no special controls guidance document, that's when you submit a pre-sub and you ask the FDA specific questions like, if we want to do this particular variation on the indications for use for the product, would we need to demonstrate with that with a clinical study, or can we demonstrate it in this other way? And the FDA wants to minimize the burden on your company to try to get clearance for the product. They don't want to unnecessarily have you do clinical studies. So if there's a simpler way, they're going to help you with that in a pre-sub. That's what the purpose of the pre-sub is for companies. However, I would also like to point out here that when you submit something to the FDA, I've seen a dramatic shift in the last 12 months, maybe even 6 months at the FDA. And this was sort of, we were forewarned of this several years ago. I think somewhere around 2012, the FDA released a guidance document explaining indications for use and intended use. I'll give an example of an intended use. It would be fixation of bone. So if you put a bone screw in a plate for a broken bone, that would be fixation. The indications would specify what bones and what population, what part of the body, what is it, the distal end of the bone or is it the middle of the bone? So those are some of the indications for a specific device, whereas all these bone screws would be used for fixation in some way. And the FDA has made a shift from substantial equivalence used to mean it has the same intended use. Now it means it must have the same indications for use. And they're saying any differences in indication for use, we're not saying you can't get substantial equivalence. We're saying the burden of proof that it is substantial equivalence has become much tougher now. So now they're pushing companies to show more clinical data, more human factors data to prove that those minor differences in indications are still safe. So that's a major shift that I've seen recently. We have another question here that I wanted to read that was submitted ahead of time. Let me read that off to you and have Niels answer that. The question was, if customers use a product off-label and voluntarily contribute the results to a device manufacturer, can the data be used as a retrospective clinical study to support a 510K in which the new device differs in composition but not mode of action from the predicate? That one's not the easiest question to answer, but
no, that's a very difficult question. Yeah, and I have been in touch with the person actually asking the question, and this resulted in a very good conversation with other people involved. So I have to admit I was not able to handle this one alone. In general, if you have a device that is not cleared via 510K or approved via PMA, you need approval to conduct a clinical study by an IRB or by, if it is not a non-significant risk device, by the FDA via the IDE. And there is a bunch of requirements that go with this whole approval process. I don't believe that companies can meet those requirements I don't think companies can meet those requirements or have met those requirements. So I would say no. But the funny thing is that in some instances you can apply for compassionate use approval or isolated approval processes with the FDA or the competent authorities in Europe to in some way get an approval for single use cases of those devices. Let's put it that way. Rob, would you like to comment on this? Or
I think you did a fine job. The key thing that people need to understand is companies will get unsolicited case study information on a regular basis if they're doing good post-market surveillance. One of the first companies I worked at in medical devices had a hemostatic agent that some of our diabetic patients would insist the product healed diabetic ulcers. But the cost of doing a clinical study for wound healing to specifically target diabetic ulcers is extremely expensive, and the FDA has very high requirements for that kind of a study to make those specific claims. So even though I would love to make that claim in a marketing brochure on my product labeling, the FDA requires a full-blown clinical study with controls. They're not going to let you take a couple of anecdotal things and post them on your website as testimonials. And I've seen companies do that and have the FDA, please remove this from your website. I even have one client that was showing how the product worked great for this one person to cure a disease that they had. It was a skin condition, and the person was clearly a pediatric patient, and the product was not cleared for pediatric use. And the FDA made them take down the video. So, sometimes it can be as narrow as the patient population you're promoting it for. Any off-label claims, you're going to get that anecdotal data. It may be true, but the FDA is not going to let you make the claims unless you do a controlled study. So those case studies are really only supporting evidence to get you to be allowed to do a clinical study, not to be allowed to make those claims. We had another question come through here that I thought was kind of interesting that I'm going to try to answer, but I'm hoping Niels might have some additional contribution. The person chatting in said, can we comment on our experience with 510K clinical trials versus a control that's not our predicate? For example, the study control arm is based on a gold standard medical practice device, or device, and not on the 510K predicate. And I happen to know of several examples, but I'll pick one that I know is public. There is a TENS device out there that received 510K clearance for the indication of treating migraines and headaches. And so you would apply this TENS device to this forehead. I believe it had one electrode that would apply to the forehead, and that device was able to demonstrate that it would reduce the frequency of severe headaches and migraines in patients that were treated with it. And they performed a full-blown clinical study with controls, and the control was a sham study, not the predicate device. So they did have a predicate device when they first got 510K cleared, but to get this specific indication, they had to approach the FDA and do a clinical study with a sham arm of the study where people would still put on this device that looked like it was a TENS device, but it wasn't actually doing anything to the patient. It was just blinking lights. And so that would be an example where the FDA is not using a clinical study control arm that is the predicate device. It's using a gold standard, which would be no treatment at all, to try to make sure you don't have a placebo effect. And that's very common, I think, for when you're trying to make specific indication claims. Niels, do you have another example that you can give that would not violate confidentiality of clients?
That is actually the guidance link I sent. The guidance document with the appendices. If you take a look at Appendix C, that is referring to a clinical trial of, I believe it's a stapler device that is doing a clinical trial in 72 subjects, and then comparing data and results to literature that is out there. So that is basically reviewing the outcome of your clinical trial, a single arm clinical study with the results of the comparator device. I'm not sure if that is answering the question, but
I think that does help. It'll point people back to that guidance document. There's one last question I'd like to ask, and then we got to go. We're already past 11 o'clock. The quick question was, when you have an adverse event in a clinical study, what are the requirements?
Rob, can you advance to the last slide?
I think I'm on the last slide now. You mean the previous one?
Maybe it is the previous one.
I'm sorry. That one?
No, sorry. The requirements in the United States for the FDA and the EU are a little different. There is two definitions that you need to think of. You need to record adverse events and you need to report adverse events. Basically, regulations in the EU and in the United States are the same about reporting. All AEs need to be reported in the database, and you need to do some kind of an analysis. When it comes down to reporting, you need to report unanticipated device effects, which means you need to rule if the adverse events are related to the device or the procedure, and you need to rule if those are anticipated or unanticipated. In the United States, you only need to report unanticipated device-related events to your ethics committee and FDA immediately. I'm not sure about the exact days here. And in most of the countries in Europe, because of the different ethics committee regulations, you need to report all SAEs immediately. And then immediately can be something like really immediately in Germany. There is no definition in terms of timing here, or 7 to 15 days in Holland, for example. But then for all SAEs in a clinical trial, which is more difficult than meeting the criteria in the United States, where you only need to report unanticipated device-related events immediately.
One comment related to that, one of the companies that I worked for was doing a fairly large clinical study on a high-risk device. It was a combination product, and as they went through the study, because it's a high-risk study, they had some adverse events and some deaths. And those weren't unexpected. However, because each time that they had an adverse event, their protocol, because they outsourced the contract manufacturing of the device, their protocol was to have the device sent to the contract manufacturer to do an investigation, because they felt the contract manufacturer would do a better job of investigating why the device failed. And the contract manufacturer, not being familiar with clinical studies, would say, there's nothing wrong with the device. This was obviously something wrong with the patient, or the physician made a use error, so therefore no trouble found, and they closed the record and destroyed the device. Well, the FDA found those investigations to be inadequate because there was really no documentation other than no trouble found, closed it, destroyed the device, and they wanted much more detailed investigation of those complaints or adverse events. So in this particular case, here the company spent millions of dollars on a clinical study that showed efficacy, and all of their data was not allowed, and they were basically they were dropped from the FDA and said, no, you're not going to get your product approval because the investigations of adverse events was not adequate. So it's very important to make sure not only are you reporting these, but the investigations and the follow-ups are very thorough, particularly if you're outsourcing it to whoever made the device for you in our current climate of outsource everything. So that's the end of our presentation today. I will make the recording available to everybody. There'll be a link that's sent to you by email for you to download it from my Dropbox folder. You have Niels' contact information, so you can contact him. Thank you very much, Niels. This presentation gave us a nice overview of clinical studies. Some of the material in here was also general to 510Ks. So he'll be able to focus more on clinical studies and get more in depth in some areas during his presentation in Netherlands. And we'll also have 2 days instead of 1 day. Plus, people will be able to corner him in a hallway and force him to answer all their questions during the networking as well. So,
absolutely.
But it may require a purchase of a beverage of some kind to
absolutely
get him to open his mouth. Thank you very much, Niels. I really appreciate your help. And for anybody that is not aware, we have webinars every Wednesday into September. I just added our last speaker that's going to be in the event. So that's Thor Rollins from Nelson Labs for biocompatibility. So we have a full slate of speakers now. And we have a lot of webinars coming up over every Wednesday. We'll be having these recordings. And one last note, anybody that's thinking about going to the event, tomorrow is the last day to get it at the price that's currently available. And then after tomorrow, it will go up $200. So if you want to save $200, the time to buy is in the next 24 hours here. If you have any problems placing an order, just email me and ask me to invoice you, and I'll give you a little bit more time that way, but you better do it quickly. Thank you very much. Have a great day. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.